Well, we've long bemoaned the state of education on this show and the falling standards of what once was the envy of the world, the United States public education system. People used to come from around the planet to see an entire citizenry with something like 98% literally educated at public expense and coming out with the best educations in the world. We certainly don't live in that world anymore. It's certainly gotten worse, and we have a handle now on how much worse it's gotten. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. A number of years ago, guys, I did a firewall called The Most Shameful Injustice, and it was talking about how Baltimore was one of many cities, how this constant one-party rule, and we'll just leave it up to your imagination which party it is, in a city will end up causing so much corruption that education becomes it's at the bottom of the list. One example we used in that video, which was from at least 5 or 6 years ago, was one of these education commissioners for the city of, it was either Detroit or Baltimore, had ordered himself for his department two identical brand new Lincoln Navigators, it's a top of the line SUVs, in black with black leather. And when his arrived, it didn't have black leather, it had gray leather. So he sent that back and had them do a rush job, which cost another tens of thousands of dollars to have the upholstery replaced back into the black leather that he asked for. And this is a public school official. Guys, I'm looking at an article linked to by Instapundit here in the New York Post talking about the latest results from some testing that was done in the city of Baltimore. So, Scott, let me start with you. In the Baltimore school system, public school system in Baltimore, one of the terms they're using is educational homicide. 40% of Baltimore high school students failed math proficiency exam, but here's an interesting statistic for you. In 13 of Baltimore's high schools, 13, that's not the total number, but in 13 of the total number, 0 students were proficient in mathematics. In the course of 13 entire schools, not just classes, 13 entire schools, there was not one student who was proficient in math at their appropriate grade level. What could possibly go wrong?
You know, it's interesting because they often make the argument that federal funding is so crucial for public schools because some of these poor neighborhoods that have these schools can't possibly fund the educational process at the level that they need to. They can't buy the supplies. They can't have the buildings. They can't do the maintenance. They can't hire the teachers to come into those places and do that. But we never take into account that even in tough areas of cities like Detroit or Baltimore, that's not the only area in that city. There are very nice areas of Baltimore or Detroit. In fact, if the city were actually being governed by Democrats and believing that the spread the wealth around idea is appropriate, then they could spread the wealth around that city and make sure that it was evenly distributed so that the poor neighborhoods got an equal share of it with the rich neighborhoods on a per student basis, for example. So I don't buy this argument that, you know, it's just that it's endemic to impoverished neighborhoods that they're going to have bad education unless the federal government comes in and bails them out. It's unbelievable to me. I mean, we did an episode a couple weeks ago about Mississippi and how it's starting to turn things around when it comes.
And how hopeful that was. Absolutely.
Yes, to the National Educational Assessment Assessment of Educational Progress test, and that reading scores are picking up. And I made the argument at the end of that episode that I think literacy is the key, and that if you didn't have the money to focus on everything, if you focused on that one thing, just creating a literate student body, that you would give them the tools that they needed to be successful as they advance through the educational process, and they could learn everything else if you just teach them to read. And then you see these schools where they're, complaining, oh, we don't have the resources to do this and that. And the other thing is like, you can teach them to read. Get a book, sit down with them, and show them the words. Move
Chalk and a slate under an apple tree will do it. Yes.
So it can be done. It's people have been learning to read before the technology existed, before the buildings existed, before professional educators existed. All of this stuff, before you could get a master's degree in education, people were learning to read. And in many cases, if you read some of the writings of our founders and framers of this country, you'll see they read and wrote at a much higher level than we are now capable of. So there's no excuse for that. And the politicians who are running this operation should be A, hanging their heads in shame, and B, ejected from office at the next available opportunity. I will throw in that I read an article about a new study that the Washington Post has done in conjunction with another organization. And this is a little hopeful antidote, perhaps, to some of what you're seeing there. As a result of the COVID pandemic, a lot of people had their kids come home, and so they wound up doing, in many cases, some form of homeschooling. Well, that's stuck for a lot of people, and they're starting to see a whole new wave of homeschoolers. Now, the way the article was positioning it was that there's a decrease in the percentage of conservative Christian families homeschooling, and there's a decrease in the percentage of Republicans homeschooling. That's not what's happening. What's happening is a broad embrace of the idea of educating your own child. So, of course, it waters down the pioneers who typically come from a values-based approach to things. And we have more and more families who are saying, you know what? For whatever reason, whether it's the values of the school system, the danger of going to a public school, not only for my kid's going to get beat up, but he might get shot, to whatever your reason is, if you can do it at home, do it at home. And it's almost, especially in these neighborhoods, you're almost guaranteed to get a better result than they're producing for your kids there.
Well, I'd like a quick follow-up with you, Scott, because you said a lot of people say there's just not enough money in the system. When I did that video, I think it was at least it was longer than that. It was 7 or 8 years ago at least. The number at that time was that the Baltimore city, that the school district in Baltimore, the amount of money they were spending per student was $15,200 each per year. So you're right, there's probably not enough money in the system. But Scott, just to follow up on your question about not enough funding, I think you can make a pretty good case here. In the article, here's a photograph of the public city school head for Baltimore Public City. Her name is Sonia Santelises, I want to say, and I think, you know, this poor woman is only making $445,000 a year.
Well, and I, as you know, when I made that comment, I was basically coming around to the other side of the table and saying, if you're going to make the argument that the problem is funding,
of course, I know you're playing.
You have it in your hands to solve that problem. But in reality, I mean, I know $15,000 is not going to get you into the finer private schools these days, but that's a decent tuition fee for an annual education for a kid in this country. And if they are spending your taxpayer dollars essentially to pay $15,000 tuition to get that kid an education, that kid ought to get an education.
Which brings us to the next question, Steve. Scott maintains, and I suppose you maintain, that for $15,000 per student per year, you could probably provide a pretty good education for that amount of money.
Yeah, which, by the way, is among the highest in the country, which our country spends more per pupil than almost any other country in the world.
3 times higher than the next country in the world, and our performance continues to fall. So let me just give you some numbers about this, because it's actually worse than it sounds. So here's some statistics from the New York Post article. Total number of students that they tested was 809 students. Of the 809 students that they tested, 92 of them were proficient in mathematics. They weren't excelling in mathematics. They weren't in advanced placement in mathematics. They were where they were supposed to be for their grade in mathematics. That comes to 11.4% of all of the students who were proficient in math. But this is an important distinction. When you break down the statistics and how it comes out, these proficiency scores were graded on a scale of 1 to 4. One is the minimum. There is no 0. So it's either 1, 2, 3, or 4. So 4 is proficient. So 11% of the students in Baltimore got the 4. And you would think that the remaining scores would be more or less distributed between 3, 2s, and 1s, but they're not. They're either 4s or they're 1s.
Yeah.
That's how it works. They're either kids who are proficient in math, or there are kids who are so far beyond the limits that they might as well not even be in school at all. And for $15,000 a student per year, Steve, you would think somebody could make a business plan where they could put together a plan to rent a building someplace, take that $15,000 per student, give them a pretty good education, and make a fairly decent profit and hire some good teachers as well. And now we come to the politics of it, because that is essentially what a voucher school is, and we are not going to allow that to happen by law. The Democrats that caused this economic crisis have prevented by law market forces from coming in and filling this obvious need. And so the people who talk so much about how they love inner city, blacks, inner city residents, poor people, are preventing them from getting they're not only not providing an education, they're preventing them from getting an education through their legislation.
Yeah, I want to talk about this. I'll get to the politics in a moment. First, I want to talk about this $15,000 per student, because it's actually a myth. I was lucky enough from 7th grade on, 6th grade on, to go to private schools, and those schools are lean and mean. Yeah, you're paying tuition, but the dollars are all right there in the school. There's not a whole lot of overhead in these places, at least not the 3 that I was lucky enough to go to.
Overhead,
yeah.
Yes.
So give you another example before I get to the point about the schools. We've had an explosion in this country since the 1960s in healthcare expenses. Just goes, the chart's astronomical. And it's not going to doctors. If you look at the number of doctors per thousands of Americans, it's a little wiggly line at the bottom of the chart. It's like, I want to say it's between 5 and 6 doctors per thousands of Americans, and it stays steady right there. If you look at a chart of the number of administrators, yep. It's the same thing with these schools. The $15,000, yeah, we're spending it per student. It's not going to the students. It's not going to the teachers, because the number of teachers per classroom it's a little higher than the thousands per doctors per thousands of people. But yeah, it's 15, 20, 25, whatever the hell it is. But it's pretty steady. If you look at the number of administrators, that's your $15,000 right there. The number of dollars actually going to the classroom per student.
That's right.
I'd be surprised if it was 15% of that $15,000.
That's a great point, because it's not $15,000 per student. It's amount of money put into the Baltimore system divided by the number of students, but doesn't account for administrators and all the rest.
Yeah,
exactly.
If somebody came to you, Steve, and said, I'll give you $375,000 if you can take these 25 kids and during the next year educate them up to the next grade level, could you do it for $375,000? Because that's what 15 times 25 is.
I would work my ass off to make it happen, because I'd want to do the same thing again next year and make that $375,000. You better believe it. But that's not how it works. These schools, just like hospital administrations, Medicare administration, all the paperwork, all the DEI training, and all the other make work and expenses and all the rest, none of that is going to the kids. And even if it were, we've got the administrators clearly don't care about education because they're not educating. The teachers are helpless, and you've got so many families without dads to crack the whip and say you're going to school and get an education. Which, by the way, I've got 2 kids, almost 18 and just turned 13, which means I have now spent a combined almost 31 years cracking that whip and trying to make them learn. So we need dads, and we need educators, and we need to cut the fat out of this system, because that's what everybody's choking on.
I bet you wish you had $15,000 per kid per year for the number of years that you cracked the whip and told them that education was important. That'd be a handy little deposit to make.
I've been doing this pro bono. I'm an idiot.
So, folks, I look at this and I see a hardware problem and a software problem. The hardware problem is the way this is structured. There's no other word for it. It's scam. It's fraud. It's fraud. When the person responsible for educating the children of Baltimore, and we've seen the statistics, makes $445,000 a year, any sensible, reasonable, rational person will say to themselves, if I forget about administrative costs, if I gave you her salary, I gave you $445,000, how many children do you think you could provide proficiency in mathematics for? And I'm going to guess the number's hundreds, if not maybe even thousands, right? So from a hardware point of view, it is absolutely nothing more than fraud. It is a way for Democratic politicians to get paid by the states, and the states get these people elected because of the unions and the teachers union and Los Angeles Unified School Districts, another catastrophic failure, largest public sector union in the country. They all go vote Democrat, and then the Democratic-run state of California pays outrageous salaries. The test scores go down. There is no connection between the performance of the student and the teacher's salary. They can't be fired. The hardware system is broken. But I think a bigger issue is the software system. And this goes to the good news that we had a couple weeks ago with Scott's show, which is called Mississippi Shows Us How, where once they started to enforce standards in the Mississippi schools, the standards went up. The software problem is that in Baltimore, even the teachers, and maybe even especially the teachers, look at their students as uneducatable. And so since they're uneducatable, they make no effort to educate them. And this cycle has been going on for 40 or 50 years now. We're probably in 3 generations of kids who have come in with disadvantages in their learning and have simply had teachers say, well, since we can't teach them, we might as well just collect the check. The good news is that if you reverse the software, you will reverse the results. We saw this in Mississippi where they started enforcing test standards. Teachers did better teaching. Students did better on the test. Administrators liked it because nobody wants to pay for that kid to do third grade a second time, and especially the kid. So when you look at this problem, I come back to this again and again. This guy needs to be on our money. But Booker T. Washington set the example in Tuskegee, Alabama, of taking slaves who had no education at all, zero, holding them to higher standards than the surrounding white schools, which the black schools got about 2 cents on the dollar for what Mississippi or Alabama was spending on white schools. That's what they allocated to the black schools in the years after Reconstruction. And he held them to higher standards, and they outperformed the white school kids. It's not a mystery. It's not hard to figure out. What's hard to figure out is why the Republican Party and conservatives are not able to take these kind of numbers with these kind of experimental results and string these people up against a wall and hang them by their underwear until they begin to realize that these people who the population of Baltimore, Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, all of them have been told that this is your solution. How bad does it have to get? Well, I think the situation now is so bad that the people who are attending these schools and the parents of the people attending the schools have no idea what a real education is. They simply don't. And furthermore, if you're going to do nothing but distribute money to people, then the argument that you hear from students in schools like this, your test scores are terrible, you don't know how to read, you will often hear, what do I need to know how to read for? I'm on welfare, my mom's on welfare, my grandmom was on welfare, and her mother was on welfare. What do I need to learn how to read for? And you know what? That person's absolutely right. That's an intelligent person looking at the situation they're in. If we think we can continue with this forever, we're wrong. It's not just a question of our future as a nation competitively, it's a question of we cannot allow these kind of injustices and this festering problem, this ticking time bomb of people with no futures because they've never been told how to get one. We're going to have to solve this problem one way or another. And the numbers speak for yourself. Unfortunately, the people who these numbers mean the most to don't know what 11.4% actually means. That's the kind of trouble we're in. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. If this makes you feel bad, take a look at the Mississippi Shows Us the Way episode, or Shows Us How. And if you want to really help, you can become a member of BillWhittle.com and keep these messages coming. We'll see you next time right here on Right Angle.